It's when it was announced Alabama-Washington, there were some of us that were like, I'll do credit to Washington, fine football team, will probably produce like 7 NFL players just on defense, but it just doesn't seem like on the surface, on paper, that it's going to be the matchup to challenge this team.
It's hard to pick a spot where Washington will have an advantage over Alabama. I mean, listen, there's going to be a lot of storylines, obviously, now with the latest transfer news of David Cornwell leaving, how the backup situation will shake out. It might still remain the same with Cooper Bateman and Cornwell staying through the playoff, but if they don't, who's behind Jalen Hurts if he gets hurt. But look, Mark, this has been a different type team. This defense is incredible. It seems like this team's at a different level compared to, at least relative to the rest of college football. And maybe it's not Nick Saban's best team at Alabama per se, but I think the difference between where Alabama is and where the rest of college football, especially in the SEC, I mean, the difference in the SEC right now is very noticeable. I think there's a couple of teams that can play with Alabama, Clemson and Ohio State. I think are the two teams that will give Alabama the most trouble. I think Washington's a good team, but I just think they match up poorly with Alabama, and I think Alabama's going to give them a lot of trouble, especially their offense trying to move the ball. So, look, I mean, anything can happen, and this Alabama team's definitely not unbeatable. But they're heads and shoulders above college football right now.
When you say a bad matchup, Ben, I think you're being a little bit gracious. But I agree. But I don't know who's a good matchup for Alabama. But Michigan State was similar in some respects. I felt that was a bad matchup at the time as well, because they had a pocket passer who wasn't going to threaten the defense outside the pocket in Connor Cook. Michigan State is known to have a running game, but they actually had one of their worst rushing attacks last year, and you have to try to move that Alabama front seven if you possibly can in some way. And so it does set up as an unfavorable matchup for Alabama's opponent, much like it did with Michigan State last year. And probably, again, Michigan State, a fine football team last year, but just not enough athletes everywhere to deal with this team. Is this defense as good as the best that we've seen under Nick Saban, and what would be the comparative points?
Yeah, I think they are. I mean, I think this is going to go down as his best. I mean, you look at it and you try to look at the entire 11. Now they've lost Eddie Jackson and Sean Deion Hamilton, 2 starters off this defense, and it seems like they still could match up with any other defense he's fielded. But I mean, you look at who's out there. Most of this defense, Mark, in 3 or 4 years, we might look back and see most of these guys first and second rounders. I mean, I think I made the bold prediction. I don't know if it was on this show or if it was on Tide 102.9 early in the year, that I thought my bold prediction for the year was that Alabama's entire secondary would end up being first-round draft picks. That being Minka Fitzpatrick, Marlon Humphrey, Eddie Jackson, and Ronnie Harrison. Marlon's projected there. Eddie's he's a fringe guy right there. But you look at the rest of it. I mean, you got Jonathan Allen. Obviously not everybody on that defensive line will be a top 1 or first or second round draft pick, but those linebackers all could be up high. I mean, you're going to look back on this defense and it's going to measure up with any of these had. But they do everything so well, and there's not really anything that you can take advantage of. And Nick Saban made that shift from the bigger, stronger defenses to a faster defense, and it's noticeable now. I mean, Reuben Foster, the guy's a lot of fun to watch. Tim Williams coming off the edge. You got a guy like Rashawn Evans who doesn't get a ton of playing time. Well, now that Hamilton's out, you'll see him and his speed on the field a lot more, but that secondary gets the ball fast. I mean, it's different to watch because these guys, it's hard in space. There is no space, it seems like, when you're playing this defense. I mean, you have to execute just like Florida did on that first drive. You got to execute flawlessly and find your spots and get down the field and take advantage of the scoring opportunities when you have them. That's the biggest thing. You're not going to have a lot of them, but you have to get it in to the end zone, at least come away with points when you have that opportunity.
So you weren't able to sort out whether you made those statements on Tide 102.9 or on Mark Rogers TV. I would think when you're on the big stage here on Mark Rogers TV that everything would be locked and loaded. There would certainly be no forgetting what you possibly talked about with me, but that's all right, Ben. We did see the scripted drive from Florida, and it gave a lot of us hope. And I wasn't rooting against Alabama. I'm supposed to be an impartial host here. Not rooting against Alabama, but it was like they flipped the switch. It was like Florida had it so well scripted the first drive, and then Alabama kind of figured things out, and that was the end of that.
Yeah, I've said it a couple of times throughout the year that there are teams, and I said it a little bit ago, they can beat Alabama, but you have to have a really good quarterback. I think that's the starting point, and you have to have a lot of offensive weapons. I mean, we've said it, and when Eddie Jackson got knocked out, hey, how much is this going to hurt the secondary for Alabama? Thankfully that front seven continues to get pressure a lot and doesn't make them cover for a long time. But I've said week in, week out, who can give Alabama any trouble offensively? It wasn't LSU, wasn't going to be Auburn, wasn't going to be Florida. I mean, Florida showed flashes at times, and then you see Appleby throw behind his receiver about 3 or 4 yards, and it goes for 6 the other way. So there hasn't been that quarterback yet. Browning's a very good quarterback. Will they be able to be effective consistently? That remains to be seen. I think it's the next game when you have, especially Deshaun Watson. I think he's the guy. He gave him trouble last year out in Glendale, and I think he can do it once again. They've got the most talent, I think, to match up with Alabama, because if they get into a shootout, Alabama, that's when you might be a little more concerned, because we've seen Lane Kiffin tries a lot of different things, maybe to the annoyance of many fans and some of his fellow coaches, maybe in that locker room. But I don't know that if Alabama has to score 35, 40 points, that they can against a really good defense. Now, I'll say that, and it seems like every game Alabama scores 30 to 40 points. So what do I know?
Well, that's the conventional wisdom, Ben, that you just hit on, because last year in the championship game, it was Deshaun Watson after a decent Michigan State offense with an NFL quarterback, couldn't get anything done, 0, and Deshaun Watson gives him fits. And then the one weakness that we saw, the one probably span of 2 to 3 quarters that we saw this season was against Ole Miss at Oxford. Chad Kelly, elite receivers. Chad Kelly, not known for his dynamic playmaking ability outside the pocket, but he is an athlete. He can run. He at least keeps the defense honest, and that was the weakness that we saw when Ole Miss pushed him to the limit.
Yeah, and you look at the secondary. That was a question mark coming into the year on the defense. Not the front guys, not the first line guys, but the depth that was in the secondary. And now you've lost Eddie Jackson there, and Tony Brown's having to step up a little more. He made a great play in that Florida game, to make an interception. So he's shown flashes. He's got a lot of talent. He's fast. He's a hard hitter, but he's not always in the right position. And Averett's is improved a lot through the year. He's been solid, but Humphrey's even banged up. So that's the true question for me is they don't have a ton of depth back there. So if they're on the field a lot, if they're covering a lot, if they're chasing a lot, can they maintain for 4 quarters if they have to? Now they have, thankfully for them, they have an incredible front seven that changes the game for them, because they don't have to stay back there covering as long, and it makes it a lot easier for them because the quarterback is rarely throwing it with his feet set and throwing it with time, and that changes everything. But that has been the biggest question for me, is that secondary, and there's only a couple guys that can exploit it.
Ben, I know you got to run. You got some obligations there. I want to hit you with one other thing.
Sure.
You know that I like to dig into conference comparisons and just dig into the depth of conferences. How good is the conference? What can we go on in regards to what they've displayed versus the other conferences? And for the SEC right now, which is getting bashed, I've actually come to the league's defense to a certain extent, because maybe the top 3 to 4 has slipped behind at least this edition of the Big Ten. I don't think this is going to go on year to year, but when you still get down into the 7, 8 range in the seeding of this conference, I still think it's the best. It's just basically, I think there was a perfect storm. Number one, that Alabama's just so much better. So when you're a conference in college football and you're trying to impress the pundits, you almost have to hit the perfect medium. You can't be too deep and too balanced, because then you got a lot of 7 and 5 and 8 and 4 teams, and nobody seems like they're that good. And then you also can't have the one great team and then the rest of the conference bows to that great team, because then it looks like a one-team conference. And that's what the Big Ten's had this year. They've had 4 or 5 rise to the top, basically 4 rise to the top, and it looks really good. But Auburn, Tennessee, Texas A&M, LSU, they all beat each other. So they all finish at 8-4, and it doesn't look very good. But I still have to think with the talent that those teams are going to, that they already recruited, that we saw in the recruiting rankings, that they moved on to the NFL, that if we place those teams in other conferences, there might be a different record on the resume.
Yeah, I think Alabama's. I mean, I think SEC's right there. The Big Ten is much improved. Look, there's no question that the top 4 or 5 teams in the Big Ten are legit. But I think top to bottom, we've seen where Vanderbilt is much improved. We saw South Carolina surprisingly look like a competitive team that had an offense that knew how to score points if they needed to. Ole Miss was good early. Obviously, suffered some injuries and they kind of fell apart. But Mississippi State, a team with a really good quarterback that could be dangerous next year. I mean, I think top to bottom, the SEC still is the best team. There's very few teams in the conference. Kentucky, you saw what they did with Louisville. I mean, there's very few teams that is going to be a Rutgers type day where you can go out there and you can pick your score and you're not worried about giving up any points, no matter who they're playing against in the top 5. I mean, that day doesn't happen in the SEC. Now, there is a big drop off from Alabama down to Florida and to Auburn and to LSU. I think LSU played their best game to stay within 10, but otherwise, I mean, every game's a 15 to 20 point game. Now, I think if Alabama played in the Big Ten, it'd be the same thing. I don't know that they'd win. I think there'd be 1 or 2 type matchups depending on if they played Michigan or Ohio State or both. But I think thankfully for Penn State, let's be honest, Mark, let's be thankful that Penn State didn't get the opportunity in the playoff. I don't think it would have gone too well for them. They're better off playing that Rose Bowl game, continue to build their confidence and not end up where Michigan State is this year after the thrashing they took. But in your argument, I do like the Big Ten much better this year.
They were going to be this year's, we'll never know for sure, but I believe Penn State was going to be this year's Michigan State. Idea, Mark. We're on the same. We agree on this one. Penn State would have been this year's Michigan State. Ohio State should have been in that playoff in terms of the best team in the Big Ten, but they didn't earn it. Michigan State earned it.
Well, that's the thing. I think they got the 4 teams right. I just think that it's hard to justify leaving Penn State out based on what they've said in the past and what the criteria should be. It's hard that one loss overrides a conference championship and head-to-head and a team that's playing as good as anybody over the last half of the season.
Ben, you always have the open invite. Always.
I love the new setup. I'm going to be happy to come back and join this anytime.
All right, Ben George, guest number 1, way back. Our friend of the show, always from Tide 102.9.